This conference has a really great reputation among all my storytelling friends in the States, and so it was really a privilege for me to get to be a part of it. Am I using the mic okay? Is that right? Okay. So, you know a story has really gotten to you when 17 years go by and you can still remember exactly where you were when you read it. 17 years ago, I was sitting in bed. I was living in Baltimore. It was a Sunday morning, and I was reading the Washington Post. And I got to this story by a writer named Laura Blumenfeld. I was a fan of hers. And the story was about the lives of 8 people who, by all traditional standards, were not the least bit newsworthy. And yet, I couldn't stop reading it. And when I got to the end, I was stunned. I had tears in my eyes. I literally just had to sit there for a minute, taking it in. And you know, when a story makes you feel so much, it's the best, right? And as corny as it's going to sound, I actually remember the thought I had, which was, oh my God, I just read a story about life in the newspaper. So fast forward about 10 years, and I'm working as a producer for the radio show This American Life. And we start making a television version of the radio show This American Life. It aired for a couple years on cable, on Showtime. Not that many people saw it. And as you can imagine, when you take a bunch of radio producers and you suddenly turn them into television producers, and you have a lot of airtime to fill and a really tight production schedule, no story idea is too crazy to consider. So I pitched an idea, which was to see if we could get permission and pay the writer to let us do a television episode based on this newspaper story that had blown me away all those years earlier. And as crazy as it sounds, it actually ended up happening. And today, I'm going to show you some excerpts from the episode and talk a little bit about how we made it. So the first clip you're going to see is the introduction. And just to clarify, the people you're going to see interviewed here are different people than the ones in the Washington Post story. But the conceit that drives the story, that is the same.
We wanted to tell the story of a life, from birth to death, without having to wait around for a baby to grow up, have life, get old. So we thought, let's just find people who are already at each of the different stages of growing older and try to capture the everyday things that happen at each of those stages. And with that in mind, we chose 7 different people. They don't know each other, they're not related, but they share one thing.
Hi.
Their name.
Hi, John Smith, how are you? Boy.
The most common name in America.
Now, today for his 2-month-old visit, he's going to be getting 5 shots.
I know. We ready, big boy? All right, ready? Big pinch. Some more.
This was another one of my favorite toys when I was little. Rattle, a bear, a dog, a moldy fry,
My parents' idea of success was wife and kids, house in the suburbs, 2 cars in the garage. It was just not the life that I wanted to live.
Okay, we're all done. Let's clean you up. Where I'm at today is not where I thought I was going to be 15 years ago.
At this point, for me, the dad's job is to begin to let go. And I'll tell you, sometimes it's tough.
Male pride that was real hard on me to accept carrying a cane around. I never felt myself old until the last year.
You remember that, Dad? There's 3 John Smiths. That's you and me and little John.
Do you remember when you told all of us that if somebody named their child John Francis, that you would give them $500 and $250 for a John?
You remember that? I don't think you ever paid me.
It's This American Life. I'm Ira Glass. Today on our show, we're doing something different. It's an hour-long story. We actually got the idea for this from a Washington Post article that appeared over a decade ago. We're telling the story of a life, of the things we all have to deal with as we grow up and change and get older. By telling the story of 7 different people, all of them different ages, living in different places. Conway, South Carolina, Moncton, Maryland, Laramie, Wyoming, Sammamish, Washington, Hearst, Texas, and Fayette, Texas, and one in Hamilton, Ohio. And so, we're bringing the story of 7 people, the story of one person, John Smith.
Okay, so that's how it started. Our original plan was to show the whole episode, and then we realized we don't have time to do that, so I'm going to be showing a few excerpts. If you want to see more, you can find the whole episode on Netflix, and I think Amazon too, and iTunes. And as for the Washington Post story, I think that you're all going to get a copy of it by email after the conference, and it's an incredible piece. Please read it, and I actually would love to hear your reaction to it if you want to email me. For the sake of symmetry, I hope this works, but for the sake of symmetry, because later I'm going to show you the ending of the episode, I want to show you one more clip from the beginning. It's sort of like the next scene that we go into after the introduction, and that's the baby. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but one of the things I'll talk about in a bit is how our challenge was to find characters who, not that they were just named John Smith, but that at each stage of life, we could try to find some sort of conflict or struggle, some sort of surprise, some narrative, no matter how small. And obviously, baby can't talk, so that's a challenge. But so I wanted to show you what we came up with for our baby John story, and then we'll move on.
Now let's start at the very beginning. You never can tell what life is going to hold. And even before John Smith was born, there were surprises.
I definitely felt from almost day one that I was having a girl. The first sonogram I had that confirmed it, they said, no, we don't see any little boy parts. It's definitely a girl. And I was so excited. Started running out buying everything in the world for a little girl.
Finished painting nursery pink, finished hanging curtains. I had the girl's name on the wall, these nice little stylish letters, Mimi. So we sit back and go, whew, all we gotta do is wait. I get a phone call. Someone's crying. I'm like, what's wrong? It's not a girl, it's a boy.
I could not believe it.
Okay, so thinking about it now, I realize there's probably a whole talk to be done just looking at these 2 versions of the same story and comparing what's possible in print versus what's possible on TV. But today I actually want to focus less on the medium that we use to tell the story than the story itself. And it's a whole category of stories. And it's one that I usually describe with a very technical phrase, stories about real people. There's a quote I like that makes the case for why these stories are important, and some of you probably know it. I first saw it in the book Intimate Journalism by Walt Harrington, but I'd like to read it because I always was drawn to these kind of stories. It was just a gut thing, so I never needed to be convinced, and I didn't really have a lofty philosophy about why I was drawn to them. But when I read this quote, I thought it did a really nice job of making the case for them. I found it in the book Intimate Journalism by Walt Harrington, who I know spoke here in the past. The quote is from the late historian Will Durant, and he wrote, quote, "Civilization is a stream with banks. The stream is sometimes filled with blood from people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing the things historians usually record. While on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, write poetry, and even whittle statues. The story of civilization is the story of what happened on the banks." So yes, these stories are important. But I want to add a caveat. And I don't mean this to sound harsh, but there's this phrase you hear people use. And the phrase is, everybody has a story. And I've probably said it myself. I'm sure I've said it myself, because everybody has a story is a really appealing idea. It sounds like it should be true. I want it to be true. But if your job is telling stories, and you want to tell them in a way that's riveting and meaningful and moving enough to stick in your head for 17 years, or somebody's head for 17 years, and you need to be accurate, and you have some kind of deadline you're working on. Well, in that case, everyone has a story, but not everyone has a story that you can tell. And that brings me to the fact that even though it's true that John Smith is, a very common name, there is no shortage of them. We could find them on Google, we could find them on Nexus and LinkedIn and in the phone book and everywhere else. Despite an overwhelming number of John Smiths to choose from, my colleagues and I, we actually had a small team of us working on it. We spent months searching for the right 7 Johns that you saw in the piece. And even then, I don't think it's perfect. And you might notice, sometimes people point this out to me, that there's no teenage John Smith. We go from 8 to 23, and the 23 kind of embodies some of like the teenage angst and rebelling against your parents. And we actually did find a teenage John, and we ran out of time and money, I guess. So we weren't allowed to go forward with him. So basically, the reason it took so long is that we interviewed a lot of John Smiths who were, interesting and likable, and you would talk to them at a cocktail party and you'd really enjoy it, and they would let us come to their house with a film crew, which is, not an easy thing to convince someone to do. So why wasn't that enough? And the answer is that I think stories like this, the real people's stories, the ordinary people's stories, have a burden on them that traditional news stories don't have. And with news stories, if you find great characters and details and scenes, you can make your story a lot better. But if you don't find that, at least you can fall back on reporting the news. So, it's like in the civilization and the river and banks, all the killing and shouting in the river is the news. But if you're writing about the people on the banks, the John Smiths of the world, there isn't any news. So you don't have a story until you find a story, until you find conflict and drama and meaning and stakes and all the other narrative tools we use to suck people in and make them care about our characters. Okay, so how do you go about finding a narrative in a perfect stranger's life who you have emailed, telling him about this crazy TV project and can you talk to him, or, you've called him up on the phone. How do you find a narrative there? Well, Jackie talked this morning about storyteller questions. And that really clicked with me because one thing I'm always doing, and this is the same like working in a newspaper, working in radio, working in this television show. No matter what medium I'm reporting in, I'm always thinking about questions that will help me report for story, reporting for narrative. And I'll give you an example. So we put together a list of questions that we would use for pre-interviews when we vetted the Johns. And the questions, we really wanted to get as efficiently as possible to honing in on, is there a conflict or struggle in this person's life? So we would, do the introductory stuff in the interview, and we would start off with things like, I have a list here. What's going on in your life right now that's on your mind a lot or that's worrying you? Is there an issue that's been coming up when you've been talking to your friends or spouse or kids? What big events do you have coming up? What are you looking forward to? What are you dreading? What are the biggest challenges in your life right now? What have you accomplished recently that means a lot to you? We knew we wanted characters facing turning points and milestones. That was the idea of the story. And we tried to target our search in ways that would sort of maximize our odds of finding those people. So we did things like search baby registries at Target and Babies R Us, and we'd be looking for the John Smith dads, thinking, okay, we could have a story about a John who just became a dad. That's a life passage. We didn't actually, that's not how we found our dad, but we looked there. We went to a company, and possibly several companies, I can't remember, but a company that provides hospice care in nursing homes, because we were looking for a John Smith at the end of his life. That was a very powerful, when you read the Prince story, that was a very powerful feature of that story, that it began with a baby and ended with someone at that stage of life. And that was very important to me to find ourselves. Another thing you're looking for when you report for story is access to scenes where you can see something happen. And you're looking for thematic threads that will weave through a piece and sort of tie it together, motifs, images, and TV, having the visual medium gave us some kind of cool opportunities that I'd never gotten to work with before. So if you get a chance to see the whole episode, you'll see a number of these threads that we use to try to connect the Johns. One of them is fishing, and the role of fishing kind of echoes throughout a bunch of their lives. One of them is driving, and the way from the 8-year-old who's on driving his scooter thing at school, and the way that cars and driving work into these guys' lives. And another one is video games, and I want to show the next clip here about the video game motif, just to give you a little sense of what I'm talking about. And I'm going to just set it up first. So this is I think it's like a 1-minute segment or so, maybe 2. So what you're going to see is the 8-year-old John Smith. He's the moldy fry from the introduction. And he's this sweet, dreamy kid who says he's never, ever going to leave his parents' house. He wants to live there the rest of his life. And then you're going to see the 23-year-old John Smith, and he's the one in the introduction who said, my parents, the life they want for me isn't the life I want. And actually, when we met him, he was really struggling to get his life together. He'd had a drug arrest, and the first scene in the piece where you see him is in drug court in Wyoming. We see him. You see him getting called out by the judge for violating probation. So you're going to see the 23-year-old John Smith, and then you'll see the 36-year-old John Smith. And I hope I haven't over-talked it, but the idea was, how did the video games play a part in each of their lives? And that wasn't something we were looking for. That was just something we noticed as we did pre-interviews and scouted and met them. So it's clip number 3. Oh, he loves to dress up in, sorry, can you stop for a second? I don't want to confuse anybody, but this kid, he saves all his old Halloween costumes, and that was his costume where he was the Empire State Building with a gorilla climbing up it. And it wasn't Halloween or anything we filmed. It was just something he liked to do, was go in his backyard in his costumes. So you're seeing the end of that clip.
Up until about a week ago, I was employed at a restaurant. I was a line cook, worked the dinner shift. It was a good job to me. I lost the job. It was kind of a shock to me, so I spent a few days trying to figure out, what am I going to do? How the hell could this have happened to me? I always thought I was, one of their better employees. I never thought they had a problem with me, and I was let go. So it took me a few days just asking those questions to myself and trying to figure out where I fucked up along the way.
Cable, we can say that.
Sometimes you have to admit to yourself that where you are in life and where you are at that moment isn't where you want to be. In my early 20s, looking back, I didn't know anything. I don't think I could add up the total number of hours that I've actually spent playing video games. I work for Microsoft in Xbox. There's on average 150 emails a day, and I'm in meetings about 5 hours a
The
day.
meeting officially begins. Callum's the only one who can do email because he's just letting them know.
I travel about a week a month.
Yeah, the initiation, the hazing ritual, you got to make it through at least one holiday.
Oh, by the way, the holiday starts now. If you haven't noticed.
I came from a place in my life where we didn't have much. Didn't have a dad as I was growing up throughout my life. I was actually the first kid in my entire family that ever went off to college.
Seriously, any last topics before we call it? 3, 2, 1, call. Okay, next week.
So another thing you look for when you're reporting for story is arcs. Somebody ending the story in a different place from where they started. And we were under really kind of a limited time constraint. I think we could only spend like a very short amount of time, like days, with each character. And one thing I learned about TV, it really made me actually miss the simplicity of just going in somewhere with your notebook because, there's those of you who work in that field know, there's so much setup and lighting and releases and all of that. So I was saying that we look for arcs, and 36-year-old John, I just want to talk about him for a minute. That was, I think, one of the most special characters we encountered, and for all those sort of strategizing things I talked about earlier, how we tried to kind of game it out and increase our odds, we found, one of the other producers found John Smith, like from a LinkedIn search, just something really random, and I don't even know what caught that producer's eye that made him call up the whole link, because there's a lot of John Smiths on LinkedIn. Maybe it was that he worked at Microsoft. It probably was. And I got on the phone. Well, I'll just tell you, so John, he has a job in the house and he has a baby. But I got on the phone with him and I did that question, John, is there something on your mind these days that's worrying you a lot, that's occupying your thoughts? And he said, my mother's dying. And this was his mother who had raised him by herself, and he was scared, he said, about, what life was going to be like without her. And this, John, you can't always predict. It's sort of a great thing about the job and a hard thing about the job is you just can't, it's sort of like Jackie was saying, you always have to ask because you can't predict, what people will say, and you can't think, well, he just told me that he thinks his mother only has about 3 weeks to live, and he's going on a trip in 4 days to see her. And I have never talked to this person before. We exchanged emails explaining the project. He was familiar with the radio show, so that helped. He was a fan of it. He's like, well, I get to meet Ira. And I asked the question. And I said, the way I said it was, okay, this is going to sound crazy, but we are trying to capture the moments that are most meaningful, the tiny moments and the big moments that are meaningful in people's lives. Could we come with you? Could we bring a camera crew? I mean, this was like a sound person and a grip and a camera person and a director and 2 producers, and he said yes, and he opened his life up to us in such a brave and generous way. And I personally try to remember those kind of things in stories whenever people say no, because you just, if you keep asking, I have the sense that it's 1 in 10. I don't know where I got that, but I feel like 1 in 10 anything, you're gonna find something good, 1 in 10 John Smiths, just staying in motion and making phone calls, looking for things, you're going to get there. You're going to find something. So we did film, and this is something you guys could watch. I didn't want to, play too much sad stuff, but there's a really powerful scene where he sees his mother, and we didn't know it was going to be the last time he saw her, but it ended up being the last time he saw her. And they talked about her funeral arrangements. I mean, she said, if you don't want to say anything, tell the minister, and he'll say things for you. But she had a good sense of humor, and it was just a really amazing experience that we could not have predicted it. And then we met 46-year-old John. I think we actually met 46-year-old John before. And this John came through an ad. We placed, in addition to sort of the internet searches, and we did, I think, some court record-y kind of searches, public record searches. We did some association searches. We had this idea, and I think inspired by the Prince story, that maybe motion could be a motif, flying, like a little boy with paper airplanes. And we thought, well, what if we could find a pilot, a John Smith who became a pilot? That might be really cool. So we, like the FAA, has like every licensed pilot, so we searched, and I think there were 20 John Smiths that we sent letters to, and we actually tried to scout one, and he just didn't end up having that little arc or that little conflict that we could boil down and find something to film. Okay, so back to 46-year-old John. He's the one who in the introduction is saying, like, the hard part is learning to let go of your kids. He answered an ad. We placed an ad. We wanted to have regional diversity, so we placed ads in some papers where we thought we might be less likely to find people. Because we did advertise this on the radio show, This American Life, but we were like, okay, well, let's find places where people don't listen to the radio show as much. And I think this was Texas. And the ad basically said, is your name John Smith? Call this number. And then when they called the number, they got, if your name John Smith, nonfiction, documentary television show, is interested in talking to you for a story about people named John Smith. And then the number they would call had a recording. And the recording basically asked like 2 or 3 of the same, kind of focusing questions that I mentioned earlier. So, it was like, tell us what you do, what a typical day is like, and your age, and where you live, and all that. But then, and tell us about something, about a struggle that's going on in your life right now. And plenty of people were like, everything's great, which it just doesn't work. Even if they're nice. It's like, I feel ruthless about it. I feel embarrassed for feeling ruthless, but I do. When someone really, and some of the people who we went to fly and visit, and then we had to tell them, and like a couple of them were mad. They wanted to be in the show, and some of the John Smiths, there were a couple that we could not make understand that the story was not about having the name John Smith. Like, all he would want to talk about is, it's so confusing and blah, 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 and I have to have this other name. And, like, you'll see, we stayed away from that. Like, we wanted to look for, another theme we had was, let's look for visual representations of the name to thread them through. But we had to keep telling, like, I remember one guy in particular, like, but that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in people who are, facing milestones or challenges. So anyway, 46-year-old John, what he said on the recording was that his oldest son, Andrew, had gone off and joined the Marines against his wishes, right out of high school. And he said, he's a smart kid, could have gotten a scholarship to college, he knew that his dad didn't want him to do it, and he went and he did it anyway. And and then he went to Afghanistan, and he was fine. In fact, we filmed him coming home and the reunion with his dad, which was sort of, we thought might be kind of a big moment, because the last phone call, I guess John told us that he had a phone call with his son Andrew from Iraq, and Andrew was saying, Afghanistan, and Andrew was saying, he said, how are you doing? And the son said, well, I haven't had a shower in 10 days, and blah, 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 and, justifiable complaining. And his dad said, well, are you really happy you joined the Marines now? And he tells us the story while we're waiting for the Marines to come back. But that was actually an instance of a situation that when he actually got back, what we filmed, maybe if we were writing it, you could have really honed in on the details of how they looked and how they saw each other and the awkwardness. You could have made it feel like a moment, but having to do with sort of how the camera guys were working and how they had set themselves up, it wasn't a moment. So it's in the piece, but that's the one thing I really don't like at all about the piece, if you watch it, is that there's an overly long scene. I think we were just fascinated that we got to be on a military base where all these soldiers came, because you felt like, we're documenting America and something that's happening in America, and this family is a part of it. Okay, so I'm sorry I set that up for so long, but so I wanted to introduce you to 46, and you're going to see a scene at the dinner table right after Andrew has gotten back, like the night after he's gotten back from Afghanistan. And there's 4 people at the table. It's going to be 46-year-old John, and then his wife, and his son Andrew on the other side, and Andrew's fiance, and another son, a younger son that I don't remember his name. And then we're going to keep playing the clip through the next segment after that, and that one's about 70-year-old John Smith.
I'm sure my dad would have taught me how to do some of those.
Oh, yeah, this was, can you stop for 1 second?
Oh, thanks.
I talked about fishing being a theme, and this is 8-year-old John Smith fishing with his dad, and what you're hearing over it was the 36-year-old John Smith, who's the one whose mother died, talking about how he didn't have a father. His father walked out on the family. And so there were things like fishing that he didn't get to experience. So we did, the Prince story is very linear. It's like, starts with the baby, it ends with the oldest person. We did more like cross-cutting and, like the general arc is young to old, but we try to do some overlap and some things like that visually to increase the feeling of connection. So, sorry to interrupt.
Blessed for its intended use. Thank you for getting everyone home safe tonight, and let us all have a good dinner. Amen.
What I'm trying to do with my kids is give them the benefit of my knowledge, maybe without them even knowing it. Can you do that? I don't know. But that's what I'm trying to. It's a fine line to try to give him some of my advice without causing a resentment.
Just tell him we're going to do this and this.
Tell him I said start saving.
I did start saving. I put some money back. I'll put another 1,000 back. Will it make you happy if I do? That's 1/5 of what I have.
I don't want you to put chunks. Just do a systematic, same amount.
I am.
Do 10%. You can live.
I already do 10%.
All right.
Yeah.
As long as you're saving like that, you'll be all right.
My parents used to say, John, you need to save some money. John, you need to save some money. John, you need to save some money. I guess they started pushing it too hard. Maybe I even resented it. I don't know. But it has never gotten done. And now I'm at that point where it's now or never. I don't want my kids looking up one day at my age and not having a retirement fund because I don't have that security. Yes, I have time that I need to do that still. I have 18 productive years left. Or do I? Things have to go perfect. And we know in this world they don't.
I had a stroke, a major stroke. In fact, the stroke I had, they said 4 out of 5 die. I couldn't speak, I couldn't write, I couldn't walk. I wasn't sure I could handle it all. They told me that maybe 2 hours a day is all I could ever work the rest of my life. So I started going 4 hours, then 6 hours, to prove I could come back. Well, it was very hard on me to finally decide that I should retire. The very first day after I retired, I found myself waking up and wanting to get dressed and get ready to go to work. I got in the car and just drove down the highway. I guess I kind of had to at least have a taste of it. But after I went down the road several miles, I just pulled off and came back home.
Representation Police of Marquette announces a gate change to all those passengers on flight 433 non-stop service to Mexico City. The departure gate will be gate D20.
That's actually John Smith, 36, walking across.
I didn't want to sit home and be a couch potato, so I had to find something to do. And I found the bath stores listed at needing volunteers.
Yes, sir. Just a question.
All right.
I am traveling first class.
Okay. So I called and came out, and I loved it from the minute I started. You're just nearly there. Walk down here, see the restroom, D34. So you're at terminal, but it's D34. D21, and the sliding glass doors. It's got a sign over the door that tells you. Okay? I had a lot of responsibilities my whole life I worked. I had 62 power plants I ran, had thousands of people that answered to me, and all of a sudden just cut it off. It left a terrible void. All of a sudden nobody needed me. It's hard to describe. You know, you go to work and everybody asks you questions, asks your opinion, or you're running stuff, and then all of a sudden you have nothing. 42 years I went to annual meetings where we caught up on all the problems the system had, and I had all my books, all my training books. I had a whole closet full of books. And about 6 months after I retired, I realized I'd never need them again. But I spent one day just throwing manuals and books away that didn't have any need for. That phase of my life was gone.
That's the science fair that they're about to go to. 70-year-old John Smith is the kind of character who like kind of makes all the frustrating days when you're like, why did I ever suggest this crazy story? Like it makes it feel worth it. And he was also found through a pretty random Google search. And the lesson for me and him is that, I mean, here's like this guy. He ran all these power plants, and he's so. I think he speaks really well about this passage of life, and we just found him, you know? We just called him up, and it was out there, and I was moved by his story, and I don't know, I will say that it's not always an easy haul, like convincing people that this sort of work is valid, and I even have worried throughout my career that I don't want to be pigeonholed. I don't want people to think that, you know, I only do, you know, I think the skills involved in reporting this kind of story, you can use to report any story, you know, that you want to have a narrative approach to, but then, you know, you meet a guy like this, and I'm reminded of this idea that you can be moved by the lives of strangers and then share those lives with other people in hopes of moving them. And that's never stopped being amazing to me. Now I'm just going to show the ending, and then we'll be finished. And if any of this was confusing, you know, feel free to ask me questions about it. I'm not speaking to the visuals or anything because I was just a content producer. And I just want to say about endings that, you know, endings are always hard, and in this case, the challenge was really trying to bring the 7 stories together as one. And you'll see how, through some reporting for story in the early stages of the interviews, that we were I think, able to do that, or we got as close as we were able to get. And, you know, my goal was to leave people feeling what I had felt when I read that story 17 years ago, because, I was just like, that is a gift to give people on a Sunday. Oh my God. Even if you don't feel that way, if anybody felt anything, then, you know, that was a success. So this is the longest clip, and it's going to go through the end, and thank you for paying attention and listening and coming, and I hope it wasn't too long. Okay. This is about 9 minutes.
Doesn't it hurt when you cut yourself?
A little bit.
I won't shave that fast. It's like...
Well, that's the easy part. Now I gotta get around this corner. How's that?
Good.
It seemed like this overnight one time. All of a sudden I was shaving, I said, my gosh, how old am I? Some days I've had a good night's sleep, I feel refreshed, and I jump out of bed and feel my body kind of give way. And that's something all of a sudden happens to you. You can't have the control that you used to have.